Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
This conversation is called The Memorable Meal, and it follows on from our last conversation, Mike, which we called The Master Servant. And this is the meal that Jesus had in his final hours with his disciples.
Yeah, very much so. It's the Passover meal. And in our previous episode, we looked at John's account of how that meal began by Jesus humbling himself and washing his disciples' feet as a prophetic picture of what he was about to do, washing them from their sin through his death on the cross. So we're going to follow on from that story, but we're actually going to go back to Luke's account because he just introduces one or two elements that's just worth us picking up on.
Worth maybe mentioning that washing the disciples' feet was a massive surprise to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we saw in that previous episode, they would have expected a servant to do this. And when the servant doesn't turn up and the meal is already starting to be served, wow, this is way past time now. Clearly, none of his disciples are going to do this. They see it as beneath them. And so Jesus himself, we saw, got up, took off his outer robe, wrapped a towel around him, got down, and he himself washes his disciples' feet.
And so for the meal itself, are there lots of surprises in this?
Yes, there are going to be surprises both in where the meal is held and in how it will be held. There'll be surprises more than they could believe because, of course, this meal was rich in tradition. For almost 1,500 years, this meal had been carried out in pretty much the same way. Now, I don't know about your family, David, but I know our family has certain traditions associated with certain times of year. Families have traditions about when they open their Christmas presents. You know, are you allowed to open stockings if you have them before lunch and you leave presents until after lunch? Some families that really stick to that. My kids just always wanted to rip their presents open as soon as they were up. What about what you eat on your Christmas day? Are you a turkey man or a goose in a family, David?
We've got vegetarians in the family.
Well, there you go. So that's going to be completely different. We're turkey, you know, and even to this day, when we gather our family, if we don't have turkey, and what do you have to have with turkey? I hear listeners now filling in the gap. You've got to have pigs in blankets. And if you don't have pigs in blankets, by the way, for any listeners abroad, pigs in blankets are sausages that are wrapped around with bacon and roasted alongside the turkey. So, you know, there are certain traditions that all of us have as family. And if they get broken, and it would be a surprise. What? We're not having turkey this year. We're having goose. What? No pigs in blankets. So imagine now what it would be like if there was a tradition that had been going on among your people for almost 1,500 years, the tradition of the Passover meal. And the surprise is Jesus is going to change it.
So there's obviously a way that the Passover meal was supposed to take place.
Yes, there was a particular ritual that was followed that actually went right back to the time of the Exodus. Just a quick reminder that Passover was one of the three most important festivals in Judaism. And this one celebrated that time when God had freed his people from slavery in Egypt by raising up Moses, and that whole story of the 10 plagues, the last one, the plague of the death of the firstborn in Egypt, but the Israelite firstborn had been spared because blood had been daubed over their doorposts, and wherever the angel of death saw that, he passed over their homes and they were spared. And then the lamb that had been taken, whose blood had been painted over their doorposts, was then roasted and eaten with unleavened bread. Why unleavened? Because there was no time to wait for it to rise. This was a hasty meal. So the sharing of a meal with unleavened bread and roasted lamb went right back to the time of the Exodus. And the law itself, the Jewish law, commanded that God's people were to celebrate this every year. Went right back to the event itself in Exodus chapter 12. But then when Moses was given the law at Mount Sinai, it was written into that law again. In Leviticus 23, Numbers 28, Deuteronomy 16, you hear how many times it's repeated. This is how important it was. So it was really, really central to Israelite life. And that's even reflected in something that Jesus says in Luke 22, verse 14. He says, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. The Greek word there for eagerly desired is the word from which we get our word zealous. I have zealously longed to have this meal. So he wanted it, one, because it was the continuation of the tradition of this memory of how God is a God who frees people from slavery. But also, of course, because he knew he would reinterpret it to the new freedom that God would bring people into through his death on the cross, a freedom from slavery to sin.
But that is a surprise for him to want to eat this meal so eagerly when these are literally his final hours on earth.
Yeah, and I think it's because of what he was going to do with this meal and the surprise that he was going to spring on them, and how he would take this meal and reinterpret it to now focus Israel's history not in an event almost 1,500 years earlier, the deliverance from slavery in Egypt. He would reinterpret Israel's history so that it now focused in him and his death on the cross. So this was a really crucial moment as he springs this, yet what would have been a surprise for them, of course, not a surprise for him. He knew exactly what he was going to do. He'd already arranged for this meal. There's this, what seems rather strange story at the beginning of Luke 22, where he sends his disciples off to go and make preparations for the Passover. And they said, well, where are we to do it? And he says to them, as you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters. Now, was this a word of knowledge? Was it a prearranged signal? We simply don't know. But it was a surprise of where they were going to celebrate it together. Why did he do it? I think because this meal and its reinterpretation was going to be so important. What he did not want is Judas betraying him before this had taken place. This was going to be so important. He knew what was in Judas's heart. He knew that Judas was going to betray him, and he didn't want him going and telling the authorities, quick, come quick, this is where you can get him. So I think he'd left it secret until the last minute and then had sprung this surprise on them. Maybe that explains, by the way, why there hadn't been a servant to wash their feet, because they'd not had time to arrange that.
Because as they're gathering for this meal, Jews across Jerusalem and beyond are gathering for their meals. So it was a common practice on this occasion, but in this case, it was all, as you say, a little bit secretive, a little bit last minute.
Yeah, because he did not want to give Judas the opportunity to rob him of what would be so important, this reinterpretation of this very, very special meal that lay at the heart of Jewish faith.
So where this meal took place was significant and a surprise by the sound of it for the disciples. Mm-hmm. How about how the meal took place?
Well, this is where the really big surprise comes. As I said, the Passover meal had a number of different elements to it. The key ones were obviously the roasted lamb, the cup of wine that would recall the shed blood of that lamb. It also had the bread without yeast to remind them that they'd not had time to let that bread rise. It had bitter herbs as well, by the way, which was to remind them of the bitterness of their slavery. So that's clearly what would have been there as part of that meal that day. Interesting, by the way, over the years that's developed somewhat, and still today, Jewish families will gather for their Passover meal, and they will have what they call a Seder plate. Seder means the order of service plate, and the Seder is the order of service that they follow. Today, those 3 or 4 elements of New Testament times have grown to 6 key elements. So there'll be now a roasted lamb shank bone, just the bone to remind them of that. There will be other food that they eat, obviously. There'll be bitter herbs to remind them of the bitterness of slavery. Today, they often use horseradish to represent that. There'll be what they call haraset, which is made from figs and dates or apples and walnuts, brown in colour, to represent the mortar that they'd had to use to build Pharaoh's buildings and palaces with when they were in slavery. There's lettuce to represent, lettuce has a soft end and a hard end to it on its stem, doesn't it? And the soft end of the lettuce reminds them of the soft ending, but the hard end reminds them of the hard beginning of this story, their time in Egypt. There is what they call karpas, parsley, to represent new hope, sprig of parsley, freshness, new beginning. And then what they call today betza, which is a hard-boiled egg, which actually rabbis have different explanations for why it's there, but it probably represents new life and new beginning. So that's grown a little today, but still a similar sort of process that would happen. I remember talking to a Jewish lady about how they do theirs, and she said, we love this meal. It takes us ages. It's a good 4 hours to celebrate. Now, whether it took Jesus 4 hours or not, I'm not quite sure, but it was certainly a lengthy meal.
I'm still fascinated by the slight secrecy of the arrangements that Jesus put in place. Does that have any kind of application for us today?
Well, I think it tells us that, God doesn't always tell us what he's got up his sleeve, if God has a sleeve, but you know what I mean. I think what's clear here is that Jesus had a plan. He knew what he was doing. And whether, as I said, it was out of a word of knowledge, or I think more likely a prearranged plan that he'd made, that I want you there with your water jar at this time, and I'll send some of my followers, so that Judas wouldn't be able to ruin the meal by having Jesus arrested, like I said a few moments ago. Clearly, God has a plan. Jesus had a plan. He knew where this meal was going to take place. And I think a little encouragement for us out of that is because I'm sure the disciples would have been thinking, Jesus, it's nearly Passover, you've still not said what we're going to do. This is so important. We've got to celebrate it together. It's okay. I've got a plan. I've just not told you yet. And I think that's a little encouragement for us that God always has a plan. He's always got a plan. I've discovered in life, more often than not, he doesn't tell us what it is until we get there, or we don't even see what it was until we've come out the other side, when we say, I see what you were doing. But let's be encouraged out of even this little incident. God always has a plan. Listeners might be in the middle of some situation at the moment where they're just thinking, how am I going to get out of it? Listen, be encouraged. God always has a plan.
How does the meal proceed through these different dishes, if you like?
Well, it's at some point in this traditional Passover service that Jesus starts to reinterpret it. Now, the reason I chose Luke's account, though it's in all 4 of the Gospels, is because Luke just gives us a little window into how very much this was part of the Passover meal. So, for example, when he's gathered his disciples together, we read in Luke 22:17, it says, after taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, take and divide it among you. For I tell you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. Now, very often we read that as Christians and think, oh yeah, that's Jesus taking the cup and blessing it and giving it. No. Let's just read on. And he took bread, gave thanks and broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." So Luke there, you'll note, refers to 2 cups. Actually, there were 4 cups of wine used in the Passover meal by this time, and the one that Luke refers to here is almost certainly cup number 3, which was what they called the cup of blessing after the main meal.
And most of us who perhaps think of communion or mass or whatever have only got 1 cup in our mind.
Yeah, but there were 4 on this table. Luke picks up the story at number 3 with the cup of blessing. Now, why does he do that? Because I think he's showing us up to this point, everything followed tradition. It was still turkey and pigs in blankets for the Christmas lunch. Everything's following the tradition. But suddenly, the surprise comes as Jesus will take traditional elements, the unleavened bread and the 4th cup of wine, and instead of praying the prayers of blessing over them that were expected, that had been prayed for hundreds of years, he surprises them. So he takes the bread, gives thanks, and you'd expect it to be the traditional prayer of thanks for that bread at that point. But instead, he takes it, breaks it, gives it to them as he prays this prayer of blessing and thanks to God, but adds something. He says, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Now, those of us who are Christians and who are accustomed to going to, it's called by different names these days, isn't it? Mass, Eucharist, Holy Communion, Lord's Supper, breaking of bread. But you all know what I mean. We are so accustomed to reading that we miss what a shock this was. Someone has just taken the pigs in blankets away from the Christmas menu. This is a complete shock to the tradition. This is my body given for you. Now, come on, let's do what we've said often in this series. Put yourself in the situation. What is the first thing you are going to think of? You are not going to be sitting there thinking, this is a picture of Jesus. He's about to be crucified, isn't he, and give his body for us. No, you've no idea. You're going to be thinking, what? Come on, Jesus. What's going on here? Everybody knows the words you're supposed to say. And yet, he is reinterpreting the story. The focus of the story, the focus of God's salvation story, will now no longer be what he did almost 1,500 years earlier at the Passover. It will be in what Jesus is about to do on the cross. He, of course, knows that his body is about to be broken on that cross. And here he is giving them a prophetic anticipation of that.
So they would have been completely shocked by what he was saying.
Completely blown. And I think while they are still staggered, trying to work out what's going on, imagine looks between one another and eyebrows lifted and, gesticulations. What's he doing? We read that in the same way after the supper. So it's now not immediately after it. The meal has progressed. They've eaten the supper. He then takes what we know to be the 4th cup in the meal, which again had its own particular wording. But he now says, this cup, here comes the surprise, is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. Now, as Jews, they would have known that prophets like Jeremiah that promised that a day was coming when God was about to establish a new covenant, a new agreement between him and people. And Jesus now says this surprising thing, that moment is here. This cup represents that new covenant that had been promised. But it's a covenant now, not in animal blood, not in the blood of a lamb that was daubed over the doorposts in Egypt, not in the blood of animals that are offered in the temple round the corner from where they were staying. This is a new covenant that God's making in my blood. Of course, he was thinking of what he was about to do on the cross when he shed his blood as a sacrifice for sins. I think they must have thought again, what on earth is this guy on about? Drinking his blood, sacrificing his blood. This would have been an enormous surprise for them.
When you personally have been part of what we'll call the Lord's Supper within the church context, how does your understanding of this story change that?
You know, the honest truth, I think for a lot of us, and even for me at times, I think we can get so caught up in what we have made of this meal that we can forget this story at times. And I have to confess, I forget this story at times, and I have to bring myself back to it. But in bringing yourself back to it opens up a whole new dimension. Now, it's clear that this taking of bread and wine was part of a meal, the Passover meal. It's clear that's how it continued in the early church. We find them doing that in the book of Acts. We find it still part of a meal in 1 Corinthians, where Paul repeats these, what we call the words of institution, as Jesus speaks these words over the bread and wine. And it's clear that was part of a meal, because he actually says in that section in chapter 11, you know, if any of you is hungry, you know, let him eat at home. But, you know, some were arriving early, eating all the food, and there was nothing left for the servants and the slaves when they arrived later. So in the early church, this was still clearly shared as part of a meal, not as either a service in its own right, which it often is today, like it might be in a Eucharist or a Mass, or tacked on to a service as it might be in sort of some free church traditions. This really was part of the Passover. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that we should be celebrating Passover, though to do it once a year can be great fun, by the way, particularly if you get a Jewish Christian in who knows how to do the rituals and the traditions. I've been part of that, and it is great, would really recommend that. But, you know, so often we separate it so that it becomes simply, I take bread or a wafer, whatever our tradition is, and I'm remembering Jesus' body broken for me. Quite right. I take a cup and I remember Jesus' blood shed for me. Quite right. But if we put it back into the Passover story, it suddenly comes alive in new and richer ways. For yes, all of that is true, but putting it back into the Passover story reminds us that the focal point of the whole of the history of God's people is changing. It's shifting from celebrating what happened at Passover when it was first instituted, when God freed his people from slavery in Egypt. It shifts it from an event to a person. It shifts it from Passover in history to the person of Jesus. Jesus is here placing himself, not Passover, at the center of Israel's story. He is now saying, I am the one who can bring about that new exodus that you're longing for. Remember, I said by New Testament times, Passover not only looked back to the deliverance that God had brought, it looked forward, longing for that deliverance that he would bring. And Jesus is claiming to be that one who brings about that new covenant through his death, but that also brings about that freedom that every human being is longing for in their hearts, a freedom from, you may not call it sin, but the stuff that's wrong, the stuff that pulls you down and drags you down isn't what you want it to be. Jesus sets himself at that story. He is the one who frees us from sin, as we remember when we take bread and wine in services today. But he is the one who now stands at the center of God's plan. He is the one who stands at the center of deliverance.
So there's a lot going on during this meal. And when you said earlier that the arrangements that Jesus made for the meal with his disciples were slightly secretive because of a possible leak of information via Judas to the authorities, Judas is here at this meal.
Yeah, do you know what? That is staggering. That is a big surprise in some ways. Do you know what? I think if it had been me, I'd have wanted this guy out. I would not have wanted him here sharing in this meal with me, knowing, as Jesus did know, of course, because we're told in John's Gospel that he actually says to Judas in the middle of the meal, what you're about to do, go and do quickly. And Judas slips out, and the disciples think Jesus has asked him to go and do a task, but Jesus knows exactly who's betraying him. He's already said to John, the one to whom I give this piece of bread dipped in the cup, which was a mark of esteem and friendship. He's the one who'll betray me. And of course, he gave it to Judas. So here is the irony of the moment, that just before the greatest betrayal in human history, Jesus will include this man who will betray him in this group of 12 who will share this meal with him. It's as if even at this last moment, Jesus is reaching out to him and saying, Judas, it doesn't have to be like this. You could still abandon your plan, repent of it. You could still be included. It's never too late, Jesus. So this incredible irony here. It's interesting in 1 Corinthians 11 where Paul recalls this. He says, for I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed.
Even references that.
Yeah, highlighting. What irony. On the night he was betrayed, at the very moment of betrayal, he's thinking not of how can I run, not how can I flee, but how can I give myself. Oh, here's the master servant that we referred to in the previous episode, still at work. Moment of greatest betrayal, and yet still, Judas could have had opportunity to change at that moment, like any of us still can today, of course.
And we've called our conversation The Memorable Meal to highlight the fact that this meal needs to continue.
Yes, it needs to continue. And Jesus said to his disciples, whenever you do this in memory of me. Now, different Christian traditions do that differently. Some have this service of sharing bread and wine whenever they meet. Some might do it once a week. Some do it once a month. There are some Christian traditions actually that see it as so special, they will only do it once a year after great preparation and heart searching. But, whatever our particular Christian tradition, whether we do it as the main service tacked on to a service, whether we do it as part of a meal or as a special religious service, this memorable meal is designed to help us remember what it was that Jesus was doing for us. So, when you next take bread and wine, remember that Jesus gave his body for you. That sacrifice on the cross, the price for your sins. Jesus shed his blood for you, and be thankful for that again. But also remember that this is about God putting his son at the very center of his plan and purposes, and recommit yourself to joining in that plan and purpose with him.
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.